It's the D Word Podcast, and welcome to today's episode. And today's episode is inspired by something I personally went through recently. And I felt that I needed to talk about this on a podcast. And it's not for everyone's consumption. I did speak about this on my radio show, and sometimes not everyone would absorb the content from the conversation, and some would. But I know my podcast audience is smart, so that is why I felt that I would share this conversation here with you. So I met somebody recently who I went to school with, and it was yonks since I saw this person. In fact, I didn't even identify the person properly, and then he met me, and obviously we exchanged numbers, right? And I bumped into him at a local cricket match. And he introduced me to all his friends. This is Deon. He's my friend. We've known each other for like 15, 16 years. At that point, I was like, actually, we are not friends. We were schoolmates. Maybe we had a little bit of friendship in school, but using the definition 15 years later to say that we are friends now would be incorrect. You may say, how come? Well, friendship is built on many pillars of a relationship. Communication is one, connection, and just sharing life experiences together. If you have been friends with somebody and you somehow lose contact with the person, they are no longer your friend, they are your acquaintance. I did touch on this friend and acquaintance thing in a previous podcast, but today's topic is not just about that. Today's topic is about normalizing the right words for the appropriate people. So I've used a friend or an acquaintance from school, but the right term would be he is a schoolmate or an old schoolmate, not a friend. Because a friend nowadays would be someone who you hang out with, you chat, and they know pretty much a lot about you without you even asking or telling, right? But it doesn't even stop there. How many of us actually use the word friend loosely in incorrect situations? If somebody is your neighbor, they are not your friend, they are your neighbor. But if you know the person, it doesn't mean that they're your friend, it means they're an acquaintance. The words that I've used here are just a few of them that I think people tend to get wrong. Now let's go with something a little bit more extreme, right? If you want to normalize the correct words with the appropriate people that are in your life, you need to understand where they're at. So let's start with family first. Family is connection with somebody who you are related with and you share lots and lots of things together. Now, here's the deal breaker, and this is the one part that many people would not get. And I'm going to say it as it is. If somebody is related to you by blood, it doesn't mean that they are your family just because they're related to you. Because they're related to you, they are your relative. And if they live up to being a relative and more, then they upgrade to family. Family can also mean friends who are close to you and share a bond that is thicker than anything. That's family, right? So normalizing the right words. I always tell people, if you have relatives that are not close to you, and even though you're related to them, don't use the word family, because if you don't know when last you hanged out with them or when last you spoke to them, even though you're related to the person, they're not really family, they are your relatives. I know that's the one thing that people always talk about. It's like when somebody invites you to a gathering of relatives, not everybody's going to be close to you, but the ones that are close to you, you know how to label it. Now, for our old school peeps, this may be very difficult to understand because we've got to pacify how we use these words. But the truth is, relatives and family are different. But we got to use it in the situations that are in. If you have close relatives who you talk to, you hang out with, you share, you talk about life, you do so much together that they know you inside out, They are relatives, but they are family, right? And that can also work for people who are close to you. Maybe you are now newly married, so your new partner is your new family, right? And we're not related, but we have a family bond. But I don't want to go too deep into that because it can get quite tricky in how I explain that. But I hope you get what I mean. Now, if we were to look at somebody who you know, just say somebody who you speak to, and this particular person, you could be working with them, you could have done some work together, whatever it is, they are your colleague. They are also not your friend. So we need to start using the right words. And correct me if I'm wrong, you guys. I wish I learned this earlier on in life. And whatever I share on my podcast is built on what I've learned and what I want to share with you. So there's no script here. I'm just sitting here in my new propped man cave. And this is a very sentimental couch. That's why it's here on this YouTube video. So if you're watching the podcast, you'd see it. And I'm grateful for the conversations that we're having here, because whatever I learn, I love to share it on a podcast. I believe that a podcast is like a document of thoughts that you're putting into action. So when I share these things, I've learned it, and I want to share it with you because you are also important to me. And if I wish that more people taught us this at a younger age, so we would normalize the words correctly. So just to give you a recap of the word friend, we must not use the word friend if you know the person. You must ask yourself, if you went to school with the person and you lost contact with the person, even though you were friends with them at one point, they are not your friend, they are an old schoolmate. Or you can define it as schoolmates or school buddy, whatever it is. If somebody is your neighbor and you talk to them, they're not your friend, they are your neighbor. Use the right words that are applicable to who they are. If you are a business person and somebody is doing business with you, they're not your friend, they are your client. See what I mean? The words change. If you know somebody because you see them in religious gatherings, they're not your friend either. You could have someone's phone number. Doesn't mean they're your friend. It just means you are acquainted with that person, right? And I think the reason why I've mentioned the word friend a lot is because if you look at all the words I mentioned, like colleague, classmate, acquaintance, old schoolmate, neighbor, clients, they're not really your friends. They belong to those titles that I mentioned. So we need to be self-aware of how we use the words applicable to the people who we communicate with. I did mention the word family at the start and relatives. That's also a big part of the conversation. But it starts with us understanding who is around us and what label do they have. Friends, however, would have a different label because you communicate, you share, you hang out. And if I use friend with somebody who you lost contact with, that would fit under the acquaintance category. I can share more about this topic, but all of us, every single one of us, needs to be self-aware in how we use these words, because it's not only good that we understand that, because imagine if you are saying you are friends with a client and you share something personal with them, and they're not thinking the same way of you because they don't regard you as a friend, they regard you as somebody who they know of business. It would be awkward. So being self-aware means identifying people around us and labeling them according to who they are in your life, where be it acquaintance, client, neighbor, schoolmate, classmate, colleague, acquaintance, whatever it is. Take the time right now. If you said, I've never done this before, well, you're not alone. I've done this a few years back, and I still sometimes get it wrong. But I honestly tell people this. I've got friends who have converted into family because they are that way. And I always joke about saying, if you look at my wedding video, the people who mattered to me were there. And they were the family, whether they were related or not. And we can carry on, looking at the different examples that could be relevant in your life and my life. But I think the simplest thing we can do right now is to understand that not everyone is your friend. Some people could be just an acquaintance, a client, a neighbor, colleague, or as I mentioned before. But if they see you that way and you don't see it that way, make sure you also identify that. The last thing you want to do is try to be something you're not to somebody who doesn't see you the same way equally or mutually. And it is a learning experience. The idea of this podcast was not built to just share things and just do things because I want to. I want to start sharing things that I've learned from, and I can talk about it freely because if I've learned from it, I'm sure at least one other person who's checking out this podcast can also learn from it. Now, I'm not going to say every week there's going to be a podcast. I'll have a podcast whenever I can. So if you're checking out the podcast on Spotify, great. And if you're watching the podcast on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. This has been the D-Word Podcast, and thank you for taking the time to watch this. Sometimes at the end of an episode of the podcast, I try to answer some of your questions. So this was a question, looking at the computer, this was a question sent through, and somebody asked me, how come a radio presenter isn't really regarded as the same way as a DJ? This is an in-depth question that I think deserves a podcast on its own. It does, maybe. But just to give you a forecast, I get this often misunderstood. People assume that radio presenters are mobile DJs. We're not. We are not in the same category because we are professionals where radio is our career, and there's a different level of way the things are done compared to a mobile DJ. And I think it's like bizarre because I get one of the most bizarre questions I get asked is, I want you to come and DJ at a party and I want you for the whole night. I've never DJed at anyone's party for the whole night. I think the longest I've ever DJed was 2 to 3 hours, and that was before I joined radio. But ever since I joined radio, the most time I play is 1 hour. And people don't get that either. They think that radio presenters who can DJ are the same as mobile DJs. They'll be cheap, they'll be affordable. They're not. Do yourself some research on it. Radio presenters that are in radio for a long time have a very high commanding price, and it's not affordable to everyone because of the experience they have, and a little bit of the background that they come from dictates that. So that radio presenter and just a mobile DJ. And I hope that clears the air. As I mentioned, I will do a fully fledged podcast on this in weeks to come, but that wasn't what this podcast was about. So hopefully that answers your question, and feel free to send me questions that I can answer in future podcasts. At the end of every podcast going forward, I will take some of your questions. I wouldn't label your name because some of you want to remain anonymous. I respect that, but I will take the time to answer your question. Thank you for watching this podcast or listening to this podcast. My name is Deon. Until next time, take care.